Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Oklahoma City Board of Adjustment meeting of July 26, 2010. If you haven't already, please silence any cell phones or other noisemakers that you may have. Just a couple of quick housekeeping rules to observe. When you come up to the podium, please give us your name and address. Adjust the mic up or down as needed. We do not allow back and forth between the two parties, so we do ask that all comments and questions are directed up to the board, please. May have noticed a slightly different seating arrangement up here. We elect a new chair and vice chair annually, and that occurred over the after the July 1st meeting into that docket, and I drew the short straw, so to speak. So I'll be directing things today. So without further ado, the first item is continuous requests and withdrawals.
We have none today.
Is anyone here to request a continuance or withdraw? Okay. Next item is the consent docket. Nothing on the consent
Nothing
docket.
on the consent.
So we'll move into item D, items requiring separate vote.
Our first item is case number 13256, appeal of Preservation Oklahoma, Inc. of the decision of the Downtown Design Review Committee regarding the approval of a certificate of approval for the demolition of 5 buildings located at 300 North Robinson, 135 Robert S. Kerr, 125 Robert S. Kerr, 120 Robert S. Kerr, and 107 Robert S. Kerr.
And I believe we have a little bit of procedural item to take at this point. Dan?
I'd recommend that the board, so that they can consider the case as a whole with all 5 buildings, to rescind their previous action, reverse or approving the DDRC with respect to the first 3 buildings.
So moved. Second.
There's been a motion and a second to approve the rescission as cited by Dan Brummett. Please record your vote.
Oops. Good. It's all there. Here we go. Oops. Here.
Everybody's off. Oops.
5.
Go on. That's approved. We'll hear from the appellant, Preservation Oklahoma, at this time.
My name is Suzette Hatfield, dressed for Preservation Oklahoma as 405 Northwest 15th Street, Oklahoma City. Well, as always, Preservation Oklahoma stands before you just asking for the law to be enforced. We're not asking for special favors, exceptions, or hardships. Just the law, gentlemen, just the law. And regarding your first procedural item, you're well aware, as evidenced by discussion in this board and what the Downtown Design Review Ordinance says, that demolitions of buildings larger than 20,000 square feet are required by the Downtown Design Ordinance to be considered separately. And as a matter of fact, the way the language reads, each one should have a separate certificate of approval for it. Now, we're not responsible for the errors at the Downtown Design Review Committee, but that is clearly what the ordinance says, and we object for it to be done any other way. That is just not fair and contrary to the law. And we have shown you time and time again, if you read our documents before, what the Oklahoma Supreme Court says about zoning and the duties of the Board of Adjustment. And just to review a little bit, in Harper and Turner oil case, the court affirms that zoning necessarily involves a consideration of the community as a whole. It's to be impartial and fair and not personalized for the applicant. This finding was quoted in several other cases in the Oklahoma Supreme Court. We've shown you again and again that the Downtown Design Ordinance states that development regulations in this district are intended to promote the development and redevelopment of the downtown area in a manner consistent with the unique and diverse design elements of downtown, to enhance existing structures, to preserve and restore historic features and circulation patterns in the downtown area. And these buildings certainly satisfy that. The Downtown Design Review Committee has the authority to establish guidelines, design guidelines, policies, and procedures to aid in their design review responsibilities. Said guidelines and policies may supplement the design criteria but not contradict it. The DDRC never did this work. The decision made by the DDRC in this case was made outside the scope of the ordinance. They attempted to make up design guidelines on the fly by considering qualities that are not present in the ordinance. And we've shown you again and again in cases such as Board of Adjustment of Oklahoma City v. Shanbor and N. Ray Dawson that the strict letter of the law of the ordinance may be departed from only when there are practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships in the way of carrying it out, and in such manner that the spirit of the ordinance may be observed. Now, on Friday afternoon, a new document appeared from the municipal counselor's office. We think that it would just be a travesty and unfair for that document to be anything but decorative here. We believe that the document ought to be titled, "What Would I Do If There Were No Downtown Design Ordinance?" Musings on a Friday afternoon. So, in an attempt to impose design guidelines after the fact, which have not undergone any public due process, is unfair. The guidelines in this document are contrary to Supreme Court rulings, as well as procedures put into play by this very board. The document is contrary to the law and should be discarded as the political instrument that it is. Now, if there's a list of companies, or individuals for that matter, that are exempt from these zoning ordinances, we'd like to know who they are in advance, because we could save a lot of people time and energy in the future by just going through that list. So, the purpose and intent of the Downtown Design Ordinance provides enough reasonableness criteria to evaluate this project. That's what the purpose and intent are, the guidelines for Oklahoma City. And our 107 Robert S. Kerr and 300 North Robinson existing structures, well, certainly. Would retaining them promote the downtown area as a vital mixed-use area? Of course. Would retaining them preserve and restore historic features and circulation patterns in the downtown area? Oh, absolutely. And all those meet the criteria of the ordinance. Now, you've said we shouldn't discuss structural integrity, and you told us not to discuss functional and aesthetic obsolescence because they aren't in the ordinance. And yet, we have a document that says that all of a sudden that's to be considered. So we ask it to be thrown out. That is unfair. And there is absolutely no evidence to show that these buildings are not viable for mixed use, a goal of the ordinance. And Sandridge has not even removed a panel of the India Temple, as Mr. Allen asked to, for assessment of the historic fabric of that building. And even if you could show that the buildings could be restored for $10, that's not good enough for Sandridge because they don't want to do it. They want to demolish the buildings to plant daisies. Now, if Sandridge were to sell the buildings today for $35 a square foot, between what they would pay to demolish them and what they would get for that sale, they could gain $4 million. Now, I think $4 million is a good amount of money in anybody's pocket. So, are these buildings contributing to the city ordinance? That's a resounding yes. So we ask you, again, to enforce the law, to reverse the decision of the DDRC to demolish, well, I asked for the India Temple and 300 North Robinson because we did not have a complaint about the other buildings after assessing their condition ourselves. So please throw out this structural assessment. It was brought in at a late moment. We have not had any opportunity to have our own structural engineer look at it. We've had a cursory review. It was part of the topics we were not allowed to discuss here. So we ask that you strictly go by the ordinance as the Supreme Court asked you to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And would representatives from Sandridge care to make a statement?
First of all, I would like to thank you for scheduling this special meeting. We understand this is a very important topic. And that you will
sorry,
be
just for the record, would you state your name and address? I apologize.
Sorry about
that.
Marcia Wooden, Sandridge Energy,
Thank
123 Robert S. Kerr. We understand that it's an important decision you make today that will affect downtown and our company. And we have a presentation we put together that will hopefully bring forward some facts that will help you make that important decision. First of all, I would like to tell you and make sure you understand that Sandridge cares greatly about the city. That was a primary focus in the development of this plan, that it be a win-win for Oklahoma City and for Sandridge. We feel that we have accomplished that. Not only do we feel we've accomplished that, but the downtown neighbors that we have are very strongly supportive of our plan. You will see from this slide that virtually all the surrounding property owners in downtown neighborhood support this project. Not only property owners, but organizations such as Downtown Oklahoma City and the Chamber of Commerce, whose very existence is based upon supporting the economic growth and development of downtown Oklahoma City. These are the same individuals that I would propose to you are the reason Oklahoma City is where they are today. They are the leaders of downtown who have led the renovation and the restoration and the renaissance that's going on in downtown Oklahoma City today. We have great trust and confidence that they know what is best for Oklahoma City. I would also like to take a second to address the statement that has been made that Sandridge threatens to leave downtown if we don't get our way. That is not what we said. If our master plan is not approved in its entirety, we will have to reassess the situation and consider our options. To put it in perspective, if you were to buy a personal residence and you spend a year making plans on how you would renovate this residence and how you would add on to it and put amenities for your family, you got secured the support of your neighbors, and then you found out, gosh, I'm maybe not going to be able to do that. Well, you're going to stop your investment at that point and reassess. You're going to make sure before you put any more money that it's going to work for you long term. That's the situation that Sandridge is in, and it would not make sense to keep investing in a home, and we consider this our home, that didn't fit the long-term needs of your family. This is our home, and we find ourselves in this situation. The assessment we made that was the basis of our master plan, including the recommendation to remove some buildings and restore others, has been questioned. We felt it was important to provide another assessment from local engineering and commercial real estate companies. To that end, we have some speakers that will speak to you this afternoon. Steve Ford with Zoll Ford Structural Investigative Engineers. He will speak about the analysis undertaken to confirm our earlier conclusion about the structural condition of the buildings and the requirements to make them safely occupiable. Stan Lingo with Lingo Construction. Stan has been the construction manager on the project since 2008. He will review the pre-construction services and construction cost estimates employed to inform design team decisions. Ford Price with Price Edwards and Company, a commercial real estate company. Ford will present pro forma information to confirm our conclusion that the existing buildings also do not work for uses outside of our own. Though this is not an issue, we felt it was important for complete understanding. Thank you.
I'm Steve Ford with Zoll Ford Structural Consultants. My address is 12560 Crick Hollow Court in Oklahoma City. As Marcia said, I'm a structural engineer, and we were retained to do a structural assessment and seismic evaluation of the 107 and the 300 North Robinson buildings. Our firm specializes in these types of assessments. We have done this type of work for 30-plus years, and we do 200 to 300 of these a year. This slide basically shows, and I just put this in to show that these buildings did not actually get constructed as you see them today. The 107 building started out as a 4-story.
So noted. Please continue.
The 107 building started out as a 4-story, partial 5th-story building, and it was added on to and became a 7-story building plus a basement. The 300 North Robinson building actually started out as a 2-story building plus a basement, was added on to, and eventually became a 7-story building plus a basement also. These buildings were built using the same types of techniques that were used in the late 1800s, early 1900s. These buildings were built in the early 1900s. The real important issue with regard to these buildings is that at this point in time, or at that time in the early 1900s, late 1800s, at that point in time, they well understood well the gravity loads, the weight of the buildings, the occupancy loads, people, file cabinets, those kinds of things. But they didn't really have a good understanding of lateral loads, and especially seismic loads. And so these buildings, as we'll show in just a minute, really do not have any kind of designed lateral load system that buildings constructed by today's current codes would have. The buildings are constructed primarily of steel and reinforced concrete. This graphic on the right basically shows the structural system of the 107 building. As you can see, there is assemblage of beams and columns, and just to put the longitudinal axis of this building runs east and west, so the short axis is in the north-south direction. As you can see, there's an assemblage of beams and columns that create frames that actually are potentially capable of resisting lateral loads in the north-south direction, but there's no beams that connect these frames in the east-west direction. Consequently, there is no lateral load system in the east-west system, so the exterior of the building has to be available to resist those lateral loads. Well, the exterior of this building is unreinforced masonry, which is not allowed by today's current codes. And so when a seismic load is applied to this building, the exterior of the buildings actually become the primary lateral load resisting element. These buildings also, both the 107 and the 300 building, are subject to an issue called progressive collapse. Progressive collapse we all saw in the Merle building. When you have a small area of damage, that you have disproportionate damage, size of damage compared to just the area that suffered the structural problem. And in the 107 building, actually the 6th and 7th floors of the 107 building actually were evaluated back in the late 80s by another structural engineering firm. That firm determined that those upper 2 floors of that building had approximately 25 pound per square foot live load capacity. Part of this condition assessment, we actually confirmed that that is in fact the capacity of those floors. To put that into into today's issues, current office loads are 80 pounds a square foot. Current residential loads are approximately 40 pounds a square foot. These next couple of slides just show you some of the major issues associated with seismic issues in these buildings. Both of these buildings are too close to, in fact, that's not an exaggeration. They're in the context of a half an inch to 2 inches away from the buildings next door. They're basically right up against the buildings next door. Unfortunately, the floors are offset between the buildings next door and the floors of these buildings. When you get a seismic event and the buildings get out of phase and they begin to deflect laterally, you see that the floors can actually bang into the columns of the building next door. That's effectively like hitting your knee and knocking your legs out from underneath you, and can lead to actually a progressive collapse of the building as you knock the columns out of the building. One other significant issue, these buildings, this is the 107 Kerr building. There's actually precast panels. These precast panels at the lower floor, the upper floors are a plaster system. None of that exterior veneer corresponds to the actual original building. That was all applied after the fact. These precast panels at the bottom are not actually hooked up for either gravity or vertical loads. And so what happens, as I said a minute ago, the exterior of these buildings, and this is just shown schematically, but the exterior of these buildings, and I didn't show all the windows and all the cracked masonry and all the other issues that exist in these buildings, but as the lateral loads are transmitted down through this exterior masonry, you get down to the bottom floor and there's nothing but beams and columns. And so we call that a soft story or a weak story effect. It magnifies the seismic loads and the impact of the seismic loads. Here you can actually see a similar type building, again, large openings on that ground floor, and you see the structural failures that occurred at the interface of the soft story and the stiffer stories. I put this building in just because it's in Louisville. It was actually located 140 miles from the epicenter of a 5.4 Richter earthquake. So it's a long way from the epicenter. Similar construction. It's only 4 stories tall, but it's similar construction to the 107 and the 300 building. And as you can see, the parapets, unreinforced, again, masonry parapets, created a significant debris hazard into the street. Obviously, a significant risk to the general citizenry. To use these buildings going forward, it would be essential, be absolutely required to actually build a building inside a building. That's effectively, and you've seen this in California. That's a technique that has been done in some of the most significant historic structures in California. But basically, the technique is that you go in with beams, columns, reinforced concrete walls, and you build a building inside the building, including the foundation. So it's very expensive to actually get in and use low overhead drilling techniques in order to get a foundation built inside the building. But you build a building inside the building, and then you hook up the existing building to that new building. And so you hook up the unreinforced masonry walls, you hook up the existing floors, you hook up all those elements to this new building that you've built inside the existing building. Of course, in addition to that, you've got to reinforce the existing floors, at least the 6th and 7th floor of the 107 building, and you have to repair the corrosion damage in the cracked brick and those types of things which are typical of these kinds of buildings. Let me go back just one moment. This actually shows you, this picture right here shows you, it's very hard to get oriented. This was actually taken looking into the side of a window in the 107 building. And the reason you can't see anything outside, that's the plaster veneer that's out there on the outside of the building. But this is the exterior white of the veneer, and you can see that there's rubble behind it. This cast stone, or the stone element right here, is not attached to the backup. The brick veneer is not well attached to the backup multi-wise. So you've got to hook all of this together in order to prevent it from becoming a debris hazard, both inside the building and outside the building. So in summary, basically, as the buildings sit, they're completely unfit and unsound for current occupants, in their current condition for occupancy going forward. The things that you would have to do to these buildings is effectively build a building inside of a building. And I explained that just a minute ago, and that obviously that involves significant cost. Stan Lingo, Lingo Construction, is available to talk about some of those costs. We have provided that. We've provided the information, the structural engineering information, as background and support for his cost estimating process.
I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
So the vertical members that you're talking about in there are not, they wouldn't qualify as being structurally sound enough to do bracing in between all those vertical members that are in the buildings?
The vertical members in one direction in both buildings, there are no horizontal members in one direction. More importantly, buildings of this time, again, because there was no appreciation for lateral loads or seismic loads, the reinforcement details are such that those frames can't function as what we call moment-resistant frames, or frames that are capable of resisting lateral loads. Okay, you would have to build the building inside the building, then you would have to provide connections between the existing floors and the beams that are there, between the beams and that new structural system that you put in. And then you also would have to put in anchors back from all the unreinforced masonry back into that new structural system also.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Well, it could be pretty extended, but I don't have the background you do. I have some construction background, yeah. And so I'm just trying to understand exactly what you're talking about.
It's basically you have to build a building inside of a building and then hook up all aspects of anything that has mass in the old building. You have to hook that mass up to the new building.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
I'll let them finish their presentation and give you a chance to rebut. Thank you, Beth.
Good afternoon. I'm Stan Lingo with Lingo Construction, 10 South 5th in Yukon, Oklahoma. And I'm a registered professional engineer with undergraduate and graduate degrees in architectural engineering. I've been working with Sandridge for the last 2 years in the actual construction of the refurbishment of the tower, the inside portion, and also the investigation of the existing buildings for the master plan study. My background is worked with Bob Cornforth as a structural engineer from 1985 to about 1992, at which time I jumped across the fence and actually got on the construction side of things. Lingo Construction started in 1998, and we work for select architects, owners, developers in Oklahoma, Texas, and Arizona. And so that's kind of who we are. I'm here this morning to present, or this afternoon to present, cost estimate information for the 107 and 300 building. And as we estimate, we break the building, even at this early stage, down into many pieces. We break it down into the components of mechanical, electrical, drywall, structural framing, masonry repairs, elevators, all the components that go into. When we estimate at this level, you cannot just go, I think that building is $80 a foot. I think that building is $40 a foot. It's impossible to do because each building is unique and different. Even though the 107 and 300 building are very similar, they both are very unique, even though they're the same size. So when we estimate, in this estimate, we broke it down into several hundred line items. Each line item is composed of labor, material, subcontractor. We then assign values, dollar values to those estimates based on history of other projects. We talk to subcontractors who are experts in the field, both locally and nationally. We look at national resources and databases to make sure that we're in line. And then we assemble those components into the estimate. Secondly, we went out in search for similar projects that are built in Oklahoma City, and we found that there's, like Skirvin, for example. The Skirvin Hotel was roughly $35.2 million as a construction contract. Not everything within that project was within Flintco's contract, and so the total project was estimated to be about $56 million. That's from internet search. That is not from any of the people there. And the project's about 210,000 square feet. So that puts us at a total square footage cost for that building of about $167 for construction to about $260 a square foot for a complete project. And so we looked at that building. How's that building compared to what we have? We also went online and looked at things like for this seismic repair. FEMA has a website where you can look at, I think they've compiled as reading about 2,000 buildings that have unreinforced masonry structures that have been modified not only for California, which is where everybody thinks the problem is, but for low and moderate risk areas such as Oklahoma and the central United States. In this database, you can search by age of the building, and then in early 1900s, mid-1900s or now, and you can assign values to those estimates. And in that case, the values that they say should cost as a budget to repair these buildings is far in excess of the numbers that we actually came up with ourselves. So what I'm saying is I guess we have cross-checked and looked at things outside to make sure our estimates are right. And we have broken down the estimates of this building into small pieces. And then we have, for 2 years, dug around in these buildings trying to find, the actual condition. And so our estimate that I'm going to present shortly is based on where we are today moving forward. To date, the asbestos has been removed from the building, and all combustibles have been removed from the building. The combustibles were removed for two purposes. One is to get to the asbestos, and secondly, to be able to investigate the existing condition of the building, to be able to actually see what is there and be exposed. The perimeter veneer of the building, the windows, the masonry, the skin, are all as they were in the 70s. The roofing and those components were not disturbed. So really the perimeter veneer is there, and the interior is clean. And so in our estimate, right there, you can see on the 107 building that the basic building to build back to a gray box. And gray box is the condition that it's ready for a tenant to take off and go to work on and finish out. And so the base mechanical, electrical, the perimeter envelope are all there, ready, complete. The stairs, the elevators, the elevator lobbies are all there. And that is $5,863,412. And keep in mind, that's composed of not just guessing at a number, that is composed by breaking this project down into literally hundreds of pieces. We then utilize Zolford's and my own as being a structural engineer's ability to determine approximately, we developed schemes of how we would brace these buildings. We looked at concrete reinforced walls, we looked at steel braced frames, and we put together preliminary estimates based on how this would actually happen. And that, on the 107 building, came to $2.2 million, as you can see there. And that is actually less per square foot, as I was saying, than even FEMA recommended that it would be. Then we looked at the cost to rebuild the exterior veneer. That's, as we talked about, the reattachment. Many of the window sills are gone. The majority of the window sills are actually gone. They were cut when they installed the new veneer. Many of the jambs, about 25% of the jambs have been sheared off. And we have gone back and established a value to bring that building back to where it would look like it did in the early 1900s. And so the total cost for the 107 building to bring it to that tenant-ready position is $9 million, which works out to be $165 a square foot based on the gross square footage. That seems pretty much in line with what other buildings in this area have cost. But this building is roughly 54,000 square feet. But when you go in, you cut in 2 stairwells that meet code, elevator shafts that meet code, and mechanical chases. That actually works out to be $222 a square foot based on a leasable square footage. And so these buildings being such a small footprint skew that gross to net number considerably. The 300 building is similar. The 300 building has more interior walls left than the 107. It had mid-story restrooms, and so there's more structural repair because we basically would take the mid-story restrooms out and bring them up to the regular floor. And so you'll see that the cost to renovate back to gray box is actually more per square foot. But the structural system is in better shape than on the 107, and the exterior veneer is in better shape. And so you see those numbers are less. And so even though there are 2 different buildings, because we broke the components down into smaller pieces, it almost is the same number. The 300 building has a couple thousand more square feet, and so that's why the square foot number is actually lower. It's $156 for gross, $191 for leasable space. And so I took these numbers, I turned them over to the, this is one of many schemes that we investigated, but I turned them over to the architects, to the owner, and then we utilized Ford Price to help, what does this really mean? And so I'm going to turn it over to Ford Price.
My name is Ford Price, managing partner of Price Edwards & Company. We're at 210 Park Avenue, Oklahoma City. I was asked to analyze these buildings in terms of the feasibility of redeveloping these into something, the 107 and the 300 North Robinson buildings. I've been in the commercial real estate business for roughly 30 years. Our firm manages and operates roughly 10 million square feet of office, retail, and industrial space. We run about 4,000 apartment units across the state. We sell roughly $50 to $100 million of real estate per year. We close roughly 300 leases per year. So we are pretty well tuned in with the local real estate market. Personally, I've been involved with the development, acquisition, or redevelopment of about $100 million worth of projects, been involved with raising about $30 million worth of equity over those years. So the development business is something I'm pretty familiar with. I want to emphasize that I didn't come to this assignment with what's historic and what's not historic. To me, real estate ultimately gets down to, does the project have a chance to succeed? And if it does have a chance to succeed, are the numbers of the project, are the returns of that project in line with the risks you are taking? So in the final analysis, every real estate project, after you get past plans and dreams and all that, it gets down to the numbers. And so that was my job, to look at the numbers. When I looked at what the project might be, I concluded that the most logical redevelopment possibility was either that as an office building or residential. I don't think it makes any sense for either of these buildings to house a corporate headquarters. As Stan and others have alluded to, the floor plates are very small. The column spacing is 15 feet. It is not conducive to modern corporate headquarters buildings. I might also mention that in terms of tax credits, since neither of these are on the historic rolls, you can do a 10% federal tax credit, but that's for non-residential use only. So that was really not part of the equation. So if we can get to the numbers here, as Stan pointed out, we start with about 54 gross, end up with about 35 rentable, and I've assumed about 2,400 square feet down in the basement for storage. This is the cost summary, which basically Stan's numbers are hard construction costs. The development budget has hard and soft costs. You've got all kinds of things from architects and engineering, financing costs, loan fees, appraisal costs, all those kinds of things. And when you get down to the proverbial bottom line of what it's going to cost, the 107 Robert S. Kerr building for conversion to a multi-tenant office is going to be over $300 a foot. And I would point out that that does not have any contingency dollars, nor does it have what is a typical development fee for a developer to go in and do this. So you're looking at over $300 a foot for a multi-tenant office building, which includes Stan's number for shell of $9 million and $40 a square foot to take it from shell to finished space, which includes the retrofit of that, the finish out of that space, plus what you typically pay to brokers to lease it. So remember that number of over $300 a foot. We can go to the next slide. This is a summary of the capital structure. You can see the total cost there of $11.6 million. Real estate projects are typically financed from 50% in the tough times to 90% in the good times. I've assumed 60% financing, which is a very conservative financing, 6%, 25 years, and you can see that all that equates to debt service of over $500,000. So if you go to the bottom line numbers, if you assume a conversion of this project to an office building at $15 a square foot, which is a very generous, very optimistic rental rate for downtown Oklahoma City, you assume operating expenses of $550 a foot, you have an operating income of a little over $300,000, and you can see that it does not meet debt service of $540. You have negative cash flow, which gives you a negative return on investment. Now, even if you were to assume that you did this with 100% equity and no financing, and someone was willing to write an $11 million check, that person's getting a little over 2.5% return. There's nobody on planet Earth that is going to take this kind of risk for this kind of project in downtown Oklahoma City and spend this kind of money and get that kind of return. The other issue is, if you look at our office market, and this chart is hard to read, I will admit, but let me just tell you what it says. What it basically says is from the period of 1986 to 2009, the suburban office market has absorbed almost 2 million square feet of space. If you look at that same period in downtown Oklahoma City, we have absorbed a whopping 93,000 square feet. Now, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but thank God for Devin, who took hundreds of thousands of square feet in downtown Oklahoma City. Otherwise, that number would have been negative. The other thing that I might mention is that when you look at downtown Oklahoma City, not a single multi-tenant office building has been built in the core of downtown since Leadership Square in 1984. I would also mention to you that if you go back to the history of downtown development, Leadership Square, Corporate Tower, Oklahoma Tower, Mid-America Tower were all foreclosed, and we have First National Center looming in foreclosure. So to think that downtown Oklahoma City is an easy place to redevelop for office space is incredibly naive. Now, remember our $300 per square foot cost. The highest per square foot price achieved in Oklahoma City for a multi-tenant office building sale is Leadership Square, which sold for $84 per square foot, fully completed, leased up, great location, with parking. So to think that this project has economic merit, I believe, is erroneous. Okay, let's turn to the residential. And by the way, I didn't want to just inundate you all with numbers, so I took one project for an office and the other project for a residential. We could just have easily flipped it. There's no conspiracy here. So if you look at the same basic format, you've got a gross square footage of 300 North Robinson of 56,000, rentable of 43, have assumed rental rates of $1.40 per square foot. I would point out that that rental rate exceeds at the average rent at Deep Deuce, at Legacy at Arts, Park Harvey, Regency, and the Montgomery. So giving the absolute benefit of the doubt in terms of rent, if you'll go to the next, okay, this is the cost structure, same basic format as the office building. The primary difference here is the finish out to residential because you're smaller units and kitchens and all the things associated with residential is higher. So you end up with a total cost of $12,741,000. Total cost per unit, $265,000. Remember that number. Okay. So if you look at the financing on this, same thing, 60% financing, loan of 7.6, equity of 4.6, debt service of $591,000. Next slide. So here's the pro forma. The rents at $1.40 per foot gets you $727, less operating costs and vacancy, you end up with an operating income of about $500,000. Debt service is almost $600,000. Once again, you're losing money. Once again, if someone was willing to write a check and do this all out of their hip pocket and not borrow any money, they'd make 4%. Again, I submit to you that there is not a way that anyone is going to take the financial risk inherent in this kind of development and redevelopment for a 4% return. Now, let's assume for the moment that, on paper these numbers did work. What I would submit to you is that there is a key flaw in either of these projects if you think about conversion to residential, and that is parking. I tested that theory with Ron Bradshaw, who you all may remember was the developer of the 300 Meridian building and the Braniff building back when Kerr-McGee owned it. I asked him point blank, without parking, does it make any sense to develop 300 or 107 into multifamily without parking? Secured, dedicated, controlled parking. He said absolutely not. I tested the theory again with Dick Tannenbaum. Dick Tannenbaum successfully developed the Montgomery. He successfully developed the Park Harvey. He has toured the buildings, separate and apart from the fact that he said there's no way physically that you can redevelop these buildings. They are way too far gone physically. He affirmed again that even if you could, parking is a fundamental flaw to either of these buildings in terms of residential. Now, you will remember the cost of $265,000 per unit. There was a recent sale of this project for $17.2, and everyone was ecstatic that it actually sold for $1 million or $100,000, I can't remember which, higher than the list price. $67,000 per unit. The highest price paid in downtown Oklahoma City for multifamily was the Legacy of Arts, $123,000 per unit, less than half. And by the way, it has its own parking garage. So I would say to you that once again, when you look at the details of this, you look at the merits of this project, the numbers don't work. There has been comparison made to Oklahoma City, to other markets such as New York and California. What I would say to you is the real estate markets are local. They are a function of local populations, local average income, and a variety of other local factors. And so what happens in Oklahoma City has nothing to do with New York, California, or anywhere else. And when you look at the local market and you look at the downtown market dynamics of our office market, you look at the lack of long-term dedicated parking, and you look at the cost of these projects, it is a fatal trifecta. There is no chance any of these buildings will ever be developed in my lifetime, your lifetime, or our children's lifetime. So that's my conclusion. I'm available to answer any questions.
I have one question. So the bottom line, I think, that you presented today is that there's no viable economic use for these properties.
Not that I can conclude.
Thank you.
Our plan is designed with a variety of urban elements ranging from buildings to landscapes. Another area of discussion has been the use of landscaping as a part of an effective urban street wall. we cannot and should not discount the role that landscape can play in urban core. Jarek Boss from the Office of James Burnett has been involved in Project 180 and has intricate knowledge of our city streets. He will speak about the role and benefits of landscape in urban environments. Over the past 2 meetings with the Board of Adjustments, we focused only on Phase 1 of the Commons. Rob Rogers with RMA will speak to the master planning process and the future phase of our master plan and how it is designed to accommodate our growth and expansion plans. Tom Ward, our CEO, will then make our final remarks. Thank you.
I'm Jarek Boss with the Office of James Burnett, 3313 D'Amico in Houston, with an office opening the 1st of August here in Oklahoma City. I appreciate the opportunity today to talk about the benefits of urban parks and open space. Oklahoma City is a very exciting place to live and work. There are a lot of good things that are happening, and we see that Oklahoma City is at the forefront of a renaissance here in the United States as it relates to parks and open space. There are many cities around the country that have been focusing their developments around these urban parks and these green space amenities. I think some great examples of that would include Millennium Park in Chicago. We have all seen the High Line in Manhattan and the development that's happening around that. I believe the last numbers quoted in Forbes were about $4 billion. And then the Gateway Park in a challenged Midwestern city, St. Louis, is going to become a new jewel for that city and a turning point. We see that the Central Business District here in Oklahoma City has a number of existing open spaces, with many that are planned or on the boards for ideas and execution. Those include the Myriad Gardens, Stage Center, Devon Park, Main Street Park, Bicentennial Park and City Hall, which we're excited to see happening as well. Couch Park and Kerr Park, when they are renovated. Triangle Park, the site of the old White Temple, a historical marker here within the city. The Oklahoma City National Memorial. Plans for a Central Park, and then plans for a Sand Ridge Commons. We think many of these urban landscapes can contribute to the structure of the streetscape. They start to form with the buildings these urban walls that create spaces that make the communities very walkable. First slide. What we've done is we put together a series of slides that talk about these benefits. The first being that access to urban parks and open space encourages people to walk and exercise, and open space contributes to the walkability of an urban area. And we would find this to be the case. I know that there were some early studies on walkability that were conducted by Jeff Speck, and projects on the board are looking to promote that within the community. Parks provide recreational and social opportunities. They are a place for people to play, whether that's children or adults, a place to gather, and a place to relax. That's not only for office hours, but after hours, early morning as well. Parks and open space attract businesses, create jobs, and increase property values. We think that with many of these urban spaces that we have been associated with, we've seen the benefits of Saturday's markets, restaurants, for example, in the center slide at the Comcast Center in Philadelphia, and then many of these urban spaces have nice adjacencies to opportunities for evening activities. Many people are willing to pay more for office space, retail space, and homes that are near parks. I know we talked a little bit earlier that Oklahoma City is not New York City, but I think it's a prime example of a key address on a park. The central image is a park planned for the Woodall-Rogers Freeway in Dallas, connecting downtown and uptown, a key piece for that city in terms of connecting walkability. And I think we've all seen many of the developments that are happening in that neighborhood in Dallas. In many cases, parks can help attract and retain residents and businesses. Many elements that parks often offer to people become kind of a piece of their neighborhood or their address. And then parks can stimulate the local economy with festivals and other events that can be held, and they promote tourism and visitors to the downtown. On the image on the left is the Arts Festival that draws many from Oklahoma City as well as the state. Another image, movies in the park. So there are a lot of activities that can happen in these spaces, many planned and many of them sometimes even informal. Parks and open space have many environmental benefits. They absorb the heat island, they can mitigate rainwater and reduce runoff, and green spaces also introduce the natural element into the urban context. I think the benefits have been proven, and I think the amenities, for example, the Lurie Garden in Chicago with its wildflowers and a place for people to get away from the office are great contributions. And then vegetation removes ozone and other pollution from the air because trees act as a natural filter. I think the environmental impact that a continuous canopy along a streetscape can have is a proven fact. They also provide tons of air conditioning and benefits in terms of cooling and shading. Parks promote community pride and give a character to the community, a little bit of a calling card. And then parks often become one of the city's key public attractions. We see what Millennium Park has done for the city of Chicago. It is a place to see, it is a place to go, and I think our own Myriad Gardens here in Oklahoma City will be one of those pivotal developments that will attract many to our urban core. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Rob Rogers from Rogers Marble Architects in New York. Just quickly, I wanted to thank Jared in particular because we've had the opportunity to present to you at some length previously, as much as we could within time constraints, the specific details of the projects. And I just wanted to sort of remind you two or three aspects of what this entails at its larger scale, which is, number one, its integration with and its ambition to be a part of downtown Oklahoma City in the most simple and direct and straightforward ways, which is participate in Project 180, be a part of the sort of growing, changing quality of open space as well as corporate occupancy throughout downtown. And we reached this through a significant year-and-a-half-long study with our client, meeting with city agencies, meeting with many of the constituents, the neighbors, everybody around, to try and understand and incorporate the components, the pieces and parts, the history where we could bring them forth and get them included into the overall plan, make investigations of previous exercises, what was imagined for the block, what was imagined for the city, and finally incorporate those with what knowledge we have now about urban planning, about landscape design, and about the programmatic opportunities that Sandridge has at present and anticipates in the future, from land use studies to walkability to radiuses to understanding that in the context we were confronted with essentially two city blocks in pieces and part that spread out. Some of it's city-owned in Kerr and Couch Park. Some of it belongs to Sandridge. Some of it was acquired during the course of the study, like 120 Kerr. And we looked at all of these pieces, including buildings of a variety of ages, some of which are the podium components of the Belushi project. Some of them are the buildings that we looked at for 107, which is we're calling 107 for today, and 300 North Robinson. And through the course of the approvals process, as we've presented our examinations, there continue to be questions. So we went back with Sandridge and had them bring in additional local experts beyond ourselves to make the examination of the structural conditions, to help us look at not just our presumptions about floor plates and efficiencies and quality and quantity of historic material and all the measures that we bring to a preservation project, to bring those at the highest and most competent level of the local perspective as well, which is what you've seen today, and couple that with our own background of, I haven't showed you many of these things, but 2 decades worth of preservation projects, dozens of buildings on the historic register, many, probably 5 individual New York City landmarks that are in our office right now, and open spaces that are coupled with historic architecture and historic preservation. We're the architects for the Governor's Island, the new park and development out there. We've just finished the restoration of the streetscapes for the New York City Stock Exchange in the financial district. And we are intimately and daily engaged with trying to understand how do we take the history of our cities, move it together with where we need to go physically, spatially, programmatically, and take that to the next level. And we've coupled those energies many times, like here at the Battery Maritime Building in New York, or with Alan's project for the museum, where in fact a combination of the reuse of the old pieces with the right development of the new pieces are in fact the way you breathe life into center core of downtowns and urban environments. And that's exactly what our goal has been all along with Sandridge, which is to come up with a plan that says there's a variety of ways in which a corporation can participate in downtown. And from the very beginning, the dimension and capacity of the horizontal footprint for Sandridge has been at the heart of our effort and our exercise, not only in terms of the walkability, the desirability of the space itself, but the catalytic action that a development like this can have on its neighbors and adjacent property owners. And so, to that end, we are intimately familiar and we're intimately committed to preservation projects when they work. And the Braniff Building will be a stellar example of preservation of what is the very best historic building that is on that block by the most consequential architect in Oklahoma history. And it has similar cost problems to those we've just seen, but our corporate client has committed and understood the importance of this particular piece and has asked us to engage in it at the fullest level of preservation. We are engaged in incredibly active, successful, vibrant public space, and as Jarek has pointed out, this is also part of the future of cities, is a very different kind of understanding of what we can actually do and perform downtown. And when you've got a client committed to maintenance and programming, a public space can be stunningly vibrant part of downtown. And the big picture is that we've tried to make a plan and develop a plan, and some of this, we've presented all of this work to city staff over the last year and a half, although only pieces of it have been submitted for your direct approval, as those are the pieces that we're trying to schedule for the construction of Phase 1. Need to understand that this is really about the opportunity to expand and develop the corporate presence in the most compatible and profitable way for the city at large, not necessarily for Sandridge, but make use of these pieces of properties, address the public spaces, address corporate occupancy, bring mixed uses to the site, as we've talked about before, and really let the city as a whole benefit from the growth and the opportunity that Sandridge represents as a neighbor.
My name's Tom Ward, and I'm Chief Executive Officer of Sandridge Energy, 123 Robert S. Kerr. I want to say thank you for your time here today. Thank you. Thanks to all the people who have presented, the people who have given us support for the proposed project that we brought forward. The background of Sandridge goes to 2006, whenever I made an investment in a company that was based in Amarillo, Texas. In June of 2006, there were 3 employees in the Reliance Tower, and since that time, there are now 600 employees in the Sandridge building in downtown Oklahoma City. We had many options from 2006 start of Sandridge through today, or especially to the point that we bought the Kerr-McGee Tower. One of those options were to, as we were filling up the Reliance Tower and looking for space, seeing that our growth was moving faster maybe than we'd planned, was that we could move outside of Oklahoma City in the suburban area and build a campus. One thing we looked at fairly hard, because there were about 85% of our employees at that time lived north of Reliance. However, we chose to move forward with the purchase of the Kerr-McGee Tower, making it into the Sandridge building, and with the goal of owning a block, having that as a part of the coveted part of what we looked at as a corporation, because we don't know what our future growth might be. We know that from 2006 to 2010, we've grown fairly dramatically. We've made some acquisitions. We've drilled a lot of wells. And even though we focus almost solely in West Texas, we've chosen to make our corporate office in Oklahoma City. In my past, I was a partner with Aubrey McClendon from 1983 until 2006 at Chesapeake as the chief operating officer, and I was able to watch Aubrey as he ran the company as the chief executive officer. And one of the many things that he did extremely well was prepare for where the company might go. If it would have been left to me at that time, I don't believe that Chesapeake would have been able to stay at the place that it is today, because I didn't have the foresight to go out and try to buy adjacent land. So one of the things I did learn by watching Aubrey was to see that you need to be prepared for future growth, because you don't know when that can come. Well, at Sandridge, we've been blessed to have tremendous growth in the last 4 years, and with that, we've needed space. Well, today we have 600 employees in a tower that will hold about 900 employees, and I have to look forward to where that future growth might go and what we can do with it. The two options that are before us are fairly black and white. We can move forward with the proposed plan that we have, or we can leave the structures as they are. There isn't an in-between option, because Sandridge won't participate in trying to build out the existing buildings, and we then would not participate in the build-out of the Braniff building, and we wouldn't participate in the corporate activities building at the 120 site. What we tried to do is to be a good corporate citizen. Since we came to downtown, we've not only filled the tower, which had 200 employees whenever we moved downtown. When Kerr-McGee left, I had 200 employees there, and have increased that count. We also have a church that houses in our space on the weekends. We plan to use our space in the public. We want there to be open space, but on the other hand, if we need to grow, we'll use the block to grow. Some people have questioned what we should do with the cityscape. Well, there's nothing that says that Sandridge won't continue to make acquisitions or grow, or to drill and grow. And with that, I envision that with that growth, we'll need to use the block, and we might not be able to have the whole open space area as long as others might like. But we will have to use, if we stay in this space, we'll have to use the block for growth, and that would require us to have additional buildings. In fact, we've already reviewed on where the next building would go past the time that we build the 120 Robert S. Kerr Activities Center. The Activities Center will have an auditorium, will have a place for people to keep their children, will have a retail space. The Braniff building will have retail space. The whole goal of Sandridge is to share our corporate surroundings with Oklahoma City and make it more vibrant and continue in the renaissance that we have here in Oklahoma City that's unheard of in the nation right now. So our goal is only to be a good corporate citizen, and we hope that you'll approve our plans. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you.
Oh.
Now, there's a request by Preservation Oklahoma to have a rebuttal.
Thank you, Barrett Williamson, 405 Northwest 15th Street. First of all, we strongly object to the introduction of all this additional information. We were told at the last meeting that this information was not going to be heard, and now it is. So I'm prepared to rebut all this, but if the Board of Adjustment isn't going to take any of it into consideration, then we'll have a pretty short session from this point forward. Is the Board considering this new information?
It's on the record.
Okay. Well, first of all, everybody's kind of identified their credentials. I'll take a few minutes and do that. I started working full-time as a young architect in 1989, licensed in 94, worked on over $250 million in projects. I've had my own firm since 1998, and we have done dozens of tax credit and Section 106, which are held to a similar standard type projects. First of all, zoning is not a popularity contest. Zoning is a law that is to be followed so that everybody is playing by the same rules when developing properties. Sandridge is proposing to demolish 338,000 square feet of potentially viable real estate, which does not say anything positive for that in the ordinance. And I'm going to just kind of go down through these random thoughts. One thing to consider, if the India Temple is removed, the facade of the pedestal building, which is immediately north, will now be more than 10 feet off of the property or setback line and be out of compliance with the zoning ordinance. We toured the buildings and would like to thank Sandridge for inviting us in, and our position, we feel, is even stronger for arguing to save the India Temple building and the 300 Robinson building. As far as residential, I think Mr. Price covered it, but, the Regency apartment sold for $1 million over asking price. The owner of that building now said, there's 50,000 people within 3 miles of downtown Oklahoma City. There's a great market for rental residential, and we feel that these two properties in particular could be viable candidates. On every project that I've done with the City of Oklahoma City, I don't think there's a single exception to this. I have gone in and worked with city staff early in the design process and have compromised on every single one of them so that they would stay in the ordinance. Sandridge has worked with the city going back over a couple of years and has never compromised. They have, quote, agreed to disagree with the city staff's recommendations on whether the project meet current zoning ordinances. The Devon property, by comparison, was a very public process. It is mixed use. They don't have an entire city block. They've got a hotel, a restaurant, their tower, parking, and they incorporated retail and held the street wall on, I believe it was Hudson. The seismic considerations, seismic retrofits and upgrades have been required since Oklahoma City adopted the 2000 International Building Code. That's when we were moved into a more high-risk but still moderate seismic condition. And there's a large number of masonry buildings in Oklahoma that have been retrofitted as a result. Typically, those costs are substantially less than what Mr. Lingo represents. I'm not saying that you couldn't spend that much, but typically we're never given that kind of a budget. So we maybe think about it a little differently and come up with alternatives that still meet the ordinance or the code. But if you took their numbers and said, well, they're $9 million for each building to do, and we contend, and I think have the qualifications to make this statement, we've got the National Trust representation sitting here with us. We've been inside the two buildings. They're not much different, especially the 300 building is not much different from the Braniff building. The India Temple still has all its exterior face brick, which is in very good condition. and all the windows on the principal facades have been removed, but those can be rebuilt and replaced. They would qualify for tax credits. So what would you do with $7.2 million worth of tax credits? You'd be offsetting $3 million worth of seismic upgrades. So you're money ahead, and that totally changes the picture. The buildings were on the site when Sandridge purchased them, and nobody has asked Sandridge to do anything with the buildings other than not tear them down. We're not trying to make Sandridge rehabilitate the buildings. We're just saying that they are viable projects for someone. And furthermore, economic feasibility is not even an issue that, as a board, you're to be considering. It's not in any city ordinance. We have already provided information to you guys on the tax credit, so I'm not going to go into a lengthy debate there. But I can tell you this. In 2005, Anthony McDermott and Company had a deal with Kerr-McGee to purchase these buildings, all of the buildings on the Kerr-McGee block except for the tower and the pedestal. They were going to rehab the Braniff building, they were going to rehab the 300 North Robinson building, and they were going to sell the India Temple, and they had it under contract when Anadarko purchased them. They were going to tear down the Y and the connector and build a 300-space parking garage in its place. 200 spaces were going to go to Kerr-McGee, and the other 100 were going to go to support the residential. There's nothing that has changed about these projects since 2005. The buildings have not gotten 400% worse. They're in essentially the same condition that they were then. The Park Harvey building has no parking. It's a fact. So I don't understand the comment that Mr. Price made regarding that.
Let me interrupt you for a second, because I know about that building a bit. Actually, the occupancy was at somewhere at 92%, and when Devon bought the parking garage, the parking privileges were lost. The occupancy rate fell to 49%, and I think it hovers at that rate today. Okay. Well, we're never going to have viable projects downtown unless we have density, which we will not achieve without increased, not decreased, density. All of the green spaces that were shown by the Office of James Burnett were public, not private. We strongly object to an up or down vote on this project. This is contrary to previous instructions from the board, and your consideration of economic feasibility and structural integrity are irrelevant. The zoning ordinance is in place for the following reasons as stated. 1, to promote the development and redevelopment of the downtown area in a manner consistent with the unique and diverse design elements of downtown. 2, to ensure that a downtown business district use is compatible with the commercial, cultural, historical, and governmental significance of downtown. 3, promote the downtown area as a vital mixed-use area. 4, create a network of pleasant public spaces and pedestrian amenities in the downtown area. And 5, enhance existing structures, preserve and restore historic features and circulation patterns in the downtown area. Sandridge has quality architects that are capable of incorporating these properties if they were directed to do so. Sandridge is not proposing to add density to the block with its tower. All future growth on all of the master plan documents that they've shared with us is noted to occur on Broadway north of McGee Street. And with that being said, and us having the final word, we'll open it up for questions. Thank you all very much.
We do have some speakers signed up, and I would respectfully ask that you do try to limit your comments to five minutes at this point from the speakers. First speaker will be Mr. Larry Nichols.
My name is Larry Nichols at 20 North Broadway. I'm chairman and CEO, used to be CEO, now chairman of Devon Energy Corporation, and I'm delighted to be here to support the Sandridge master plan. Bear in mind that Sandridge is a competitor of ours. They sometimes mistakenly try and hire our employees. They sometimes get to oil and gas leases before we do. They do act like competitors. But they've always acted at the highest level of ethics and the highest standards in the industry and have the respect of the other oil and gas companies in the industry. When I read that they were going to buy the Kerr-McGee building and move downtown, I was absolutely delighted. I was delighted as a former chairman of the Oklahoma City Chamber because I know how difficult it is to recruit corporate headquarters to a downtown environment or to any city. And corporate headquarters, local owners do matter. Corporate headquarters inevitably provide more support for the community in which they're in. Local ownership inevitably spends more money on buildings that they own than absentee out-of-town owners do. And you can certainly look at the Sandridge plan and see exactly that they are behaving in a remarkable way, investing amount of money into that city block that no out-of-town company would do. So I was delighted when I saw that. I was also curious because Devon had looked at that site at one time as a potential site for our own building. It wasn't big enough. The Kerr-McGee Tower is a little over 400,000 square feet, and we're building 1.8 million. So clearly we needed a lot more space than was there. But we did look at that site to see if there was a way we could build another tower, if we could incorporate it. And we recognized that there were some buildings there, the Braniff building, that really was an interesting building that looked like it had architectural interest and structural integrity. But the others looked old, dilapidated, and there was nothing there to preserve. So I was curious when I saw their plan and when I heard of the opposition about that India Temple building, recognizing that since 1971 I'd officed 2 blocks from that building and had never heard of it before. I was more than a little curious about what was there, went inside to take a look. Devon has played a role in historical preservation. Several years ago, Bill Gummerson, then the chairman of Oklahoma Preservation, approached me to give money to protect the Overholser Mansion, whose roof was in a leaky and bad condition. And Devon donated $250,000 to Preservation Oklahoma for that building. To my knowledge, certainly at that time, no corporation had ever given a donation of that size for that kind of project, even though it was far outside of what one might view as Devon's main mission. And even though we did not want and certainly did not get any publicity over it, there was a building that was clearly worth preserving. You could go in that building and just feel the atmosphere and the world that existed at a distant time. When we bought our own site, we looked at the Concord Hotel, another old building built in the early 1900s. It would have been somewhat easier to tear that down. But there was a building that also had historical appeal, had street-side curb appeal. You could see the unique features of that building. And we have spent literally millions of dollars inside that building, making that building structurally functional and still preserving the interesting characteristics of that building, both inside and outside. So I was very curious to see what category the India Temple building would fall into. And when I went to look at the inside of that building, I was amazed. There's nothing there. If you tour that building, there's nothing there to preserve. Unlike touring the Skirvin Hotel when it was shut up and abandoned for years, you could go look at that building and say, wow, look at those features around the elevators. Look at those features. You could really do something with that. Inside that building, there's nothing except concrete. Unless you value old concrete, there's nothing there to preserve at all. When you look at the outside between the new shell and the old shell, most of that red brick is gone. As they punched holes in it to build the new shell, they tore that apart. As they built the new windows, they tore that apart. The resurrection that I heard earlier, those numbers are not about preserving anything. They're about building a new building, a brand new building that might look like what an old building might be. But they're not preserving anything there, unlike the Skirvin, unlike the Concord, where you can look at the old pictures and say, we're going to have something that looks and feels very much like that. We do have positive momentum in this city. It is not tremendous momentum, and it is momentum that other cities would love to take away. We do need, as we build this city, to preserve those things that are worth preserving. And if you look at these buildings, both inside and outside, there is nothing of either historical or architectural context that rises to that level. And we certainly don't want to have a reputation where we're a city where you can't build anything, where obstructionists will stop you from tearing down the old to make a new, vibrant city where we can attract quality jobs to this city. So I earnestly support you to take a hard look at that. When you look at that building, just ask one simple question. Is there anything there that's worth preserving, inside or out? And I would be surprised if you don't unanimously come to an answer to say, no, this is not the building that you want to work to preserve, because whatever was there is long gone. Thank you very much.
I got a question.
Yes.
For you.
Not about parking, is it?
When you get your new building completed, how many square feet of office space will you vacate in Oklahoma City that you've got leased right now?
We will vacate about 800,000 square feet, 850, and we are working very hard on trying to attract other companies from outside this city to moving into this city. So I know how difficult that is. And to add to that space that we're vacating, which we have to, we're now in 6 different buildings downtown. We can't function anymore, which is why we're building a new building. To add all of that space on the Kerr-McGee site to the inventory would really cause a great difficulty for this city.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Bill Gummerson, please.
Thank you. My name is Bill Gummerson, 4019 Classen Boulevard, Oklahoma City. I'd like to read a letter and then submit it to you all for the record, please. It is addressed to the Board of Adjustment, City of Oklahoma City. I have been involved with historic preservation since the early 70s. In addition to my volunteer efforts, I've also been involved professionally and active in many restoration projects over the years. The following is my sole opinion, given strictly on a volunteer basis, because I believe it's the right thing to do. After my site visit last week of the structures in question, it became quite apparent to me that the real historic impact and value of these buildings has been compromised in the past to the extent that one must truly stretch their imagination to say that anything of historic value remains. The Braniff building, however, does in fact possess a historic value. Comparing it to the buildings being considered for demolition is like night and day. For a myriad of reasons, the economic and functional values of these structures are no longer viable. One would have to replicate, with the exception of some masonry, any and all fabric that once existed. Most importantly, Oklahoma City is on the right path, but we are at a critical juncture in the growth of our downtown. The Sandridge headquarters investment is a key part of the continuing momentum that is transforming our city for the better. Ironically, Sandridge's investment is exactly what is needed in order for this city to be in a position to preserve worthy, historic buildings in the future. For the reasons stated, I urge this board to endorse the Sandridge proposal and deny the appeal before you, allowing our city to move forward in a positive fashion. Respectfully. I submit these.
Thank you, Mr. Gummerson. Mr. Ralph McCalmont. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
My name is Ralph McCalmont, and I live at 3348 Rock Hollow Road, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And what I have handed to you are my credentials as a preservationist. Some people think I travel under the guise of being a banker, but my passion has been preservation for many, many years. I was a founding director and past president of Preservation Oklahoma. And it's a wonderful organization. It was brought into being to do a very specific job in the state, and it has done a marvelous job of it. Why I'm standing here with you today, we preservationists do not at all times agree with one another, and I am not in agreement with the present position that Preservation Oklahoma has taken with this. In no way do I wish to denigrate what they do or the motivation of the people that are doing this. But I do strongly disagree with them. You've already heard testimony from a number of people, and I will not try to echo what Mr. Gummerson has said or others have said about it. But I do want you to know that Preservation Oklahoma is not totally together with this. There are other past presidents and other former directors and very interested, passionate people that disagree with this opinion. I'm also a past director and past president of Oklahoma Historical Society. I work closely with the SHPO's office, the Historic Preservation Office, and with them. I have chatted with them. I'm not at liberty to be quoting and speaking for them, but when I came away, I heard nothing from them whatsoever that encouraged me to change the position I have opposing this, as I've stated to you. I'm also a founding director of Main Street, Oklahoma. Actually, the first Main Street model that was ever brought to being in this nation was in Guthrie, Oklahoma. We started that, and as a result, that's how I became connected with the National Trust. The Main Street model in Guthrie, Oklahoma was developed. It's a wonderful economic model for both the economics of Main Street towns and for preservation of those towns. And we thought highly of it. We lobbied Governor Nye to bring it to Oklahoma as a project. There are now numerous towns in Oklahoma that are being serviced by that, and that includes Oklahoma City. We have the urban version of Main Street, which is out at the stockyards now. We also have the urban version of it, which has been considered and looked and has been a very huge part of Automobile Alley. And I'll not speak for Meg Salyer, but I suppose if anyone spoke to Meg Salyer, they would find strong opposition to the position that Preservation Oklahoma is taking just now. I'm a past trustee and a trustee emeriti of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I served as a chair of their finance committee and on their executive committee for some 6 years. And while I know that the National Trust representative from Fort Worth has spoken in front of you all, the National Trust is not totally together, and all of us who are involved in the National Trust, including former trustees from Oklahoma, do not support the Preservation Oklahoma's position. We have, I'll not go on, but I was a founding director and past president of the Logan County Historical Society and spent many years in financing historic structures. We lost a lot of money on some of them, and I'm very proud of some we did. We didn't have the most stellar position, but I think most people would agree that the renaissance that occurred there was a good one and has been good for our state. And as a local banker, I was very extensively involved in both planning and financing of those. And now I come to the fact, I have recently toured these buildings that are in question here. When I go through, if I were a banker, I would not loan money for those because I would know that some huge haircuts would have to be taken down the line. I do not think that the two buildings that specifically are in question are viable to be done, nor did I see enough historic merit in them. I do see some need for honoring what has happened in those buildings. They are special, and I have heard every indication from Sand Ridge that they would do so. They would honor them very respectfully. I've also was past president of Oklahoma City Museum of Art and was part of the strategy for developing that. Unfortunately for us, as we looked at it, we could not restore the Center Theater that we occupied downtown because it just simply was not viable. We talked with the preservation community at that time, many of whom are present today, and they concurred that we would be as respectful as we could be, but we could not do that. So I oppose the position that Preservation Oklahoma has taken, and I heartily support what Sand Ridge has done. And I think, ironically, I'll speak the words of a good friend of mine, ironically, I think what Sand Ridge is doing is going to help us in the future in preserving other worthy historic buildings in downtown Oklahoma City. And all of us know that there are several down there that are going to be massive jobs to do, and we're going to all have to hold hands to get it done. Thank you.
And Jonathan Poston.
Good afternoon, members of the Board of Adjustment. Jonathan Poston, representing the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm the director of the Southwest Office of the National Trust in Fort Worth, and we serve 4 states, including Oklahoma. I've had the privilege of visiting your city a lot in the last few months before this process started, but 3 times through this process. I have to say that I am surprised by today's hearing because of the introduction of so much new material. I spent about 25 years appearing before a Board of Adjustment, and usually in appeal hearings, appeals are based on the record and on the ordinance, and I'm very concerned about that because it's changed, in many ways, the tenor of the debate today. I think it's important to say at the outset that there are all sorts of great people in this room who are thinking as best they can about the future of Oklahoma City. And that's true on both sides of the equation. I would say to you, too, that you have a very good downtown design review ordinance. I think it's extraordinary. I think it's almost one we could hold up as an example. And what I'm urging you to do is stick to your ordinance, which lays out clearly how this application was to be evaluated and why it's the subject of the appeal today. So please do consider that ordinance. And we continue to support Preservation Oklahoma in its concerns over the proposed demolition of these 5 buildings, especially 3 of them, including the India Temple and the Kerr-McGee. And at the National Trust, we don't take processes like this lightly. I have to tell you that before I ever embarked to support Preservation Oklahoma, I entered into a conference call with a number of officials at our headquarters in Washington with expertise in architecture, planning, several planners, preservation, and law. And we looked at particularly what the implications of this application were. And we found that there were 3 very essential issues here that conflict with the goals of what the National Trust stands for. One is to remove this amount of urban fabric from a historic district. Now, whether we want to debate the architectural character of the India Temple or the Kerr-McGee, I don't know, because I had hoped to go in. I was never able to go in to those buildings, but I do trust the opinion of very fine architect Barrett Williamson about the historic fabric and a discussion that I had with your city preservation officer some time ago about them, and particularly about the India Temple and about its historical character. And to remove several 100,000 square feet of buildings from an historic district when they could be rehabilitated, and we still believe that at least 2 of them, certainly the India Temple and Kerr-McGee, could be successfully rehabilitated, and there are many, many examples from other cities of where that's happened with even less urban fabric surviving. But we also are concerned about what it will do to the urban character, since we're sort of talking about some new elements here of downtown Oklahoma City. Now, there was someone on the Sandridge's team who talked about landscapes and urban landscapes in cities like Chicago and New York, but my friends at the Landmarks Council, Preservation Council of Illinois, or the New York Landmarks Conservancy, though, would be quick to point out that the density of the urban fabric is then what leads those public spaces, many of them long existing, to be important to contributing to the urban character of those cities, and that to simply remove this amount of building, including key corner buildings, is what is such a problem. The National Trust is now in partnership with the Partners for Public Spaces, which is an effort which looks not at removing urban fabric, but adding to the vitality by tucking in public spaces and landscapes into key areas. And that's what's so important. And finally, just from a sustainability standpoint, to add hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tons of debris to your area landfills when it doesn't have to be. And the National Trust now is so concerned about sustainable communities and about the fabric and preserving the fabric of communities as part of a sustainable direction for all communities. We do believe, and the National Trust continues to believe, that these buildings can be rehabilitated. It may not be by Sandridge, it might be by others, but it sometimes takes, just a little bit of forbearance and a little bit of patience to see that happen. I come from Charleston, South Carolina. There's no city in America other than San Francisco and Los Angeles that's been so tumulted by, I should say that's the wrong word, plummeted in some ways by earthquakes in its past, the 6th largest earthquake to occur in America. Well, we have hundreds and hundreds of 18th and 19th century buildings. We would certainly not let them be torn down by issues pertaining to earthquakes. They can be strengthened, That is always possible. But it's important that as a community, you value your historic assets. We hope that you will, and we thank you, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today.
Thank you.
We just weren't sure if we would be discussing the structural and the economic feasibility issues today, and but came with some before and after pictures. I know we've talked a lot about other projects that show the feasibility of these rehabilitations, but there's one right up the street from us, the Seabra Hotel, and we just wanted to share some before and after images of how that project was done. These are buildings that were in very poor condition and were restored and are now occupied and are now a beautiful asset to the city that has really spurred growth in that part of the city. Just wanted to share these. I know the developer responsible for that project is here if anyone had questions about that.
Thank you. We do have one more speaker signed up, Mr. Kent Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Kent Johnson. I'm at 5100 North Classen, Suite 110 in Oklahoma City. I am speaking not as a representative of anybody who's spoken here before, any preservation group, but I am a longtime Oklahoma City resident. I have been concerned about the destruction, demolition of some of our oldest structures. All of us are very familiar with our history in that regard. I've been so encouraged to see some of the older buildings that have been saved more recently that are being utilized in a way that I could not have foreseen, and am very encouraged about that. I live in an older home myself. I can't replace the windows there, much less demolition would be out of the question. And I say that only to say that we have in the India Temple building a building that the Oklahoma Heritage Association plaque indicates the history of that building, being the first Oklahoma City state capital. Many other buildings with less significant history than that have been preserved. There was just a mention of the Seabra Hotel. I wanted to recognize the efforts of Steve Mason on the buildings along the old Broadway Automobile Alley, including what he's done with some old buildings on 9th Street. The Salyers preservation of the Magnolia Petroleum building at 722 Broadway. The Skirvin Hotel's been mentioned. All of the old Bricktown warehouses that have been preserved and have been made viable in a way that I think many of us would have not anticipated. The old Walnut Bridge. I think many structures that have been saved by people with some foresight as times dictated. It was mentioned that there is viability to a combination of saving old structures and integrating those with the more modern structures, and that's been commented on, and I agree with that. I feel like that, and this is certainly not a legal argument, only a preservation argument, but I understand that the ordinance involving demolition of existing structures, that demolition is the last resort. And it seems to me that there's so many uncertainties in the future here to say that we're going to make a hard and fast decision right now to destroy these two buildings And again, the ones that I support, and I'm not sure where that stands, but the ones that I support are the retention of the India Temple building that's been discussed and the Oklahoma Savings and Loan building at 300 North Robinson. And I think that as a compromise, that Sand Ridge's phasing of its project could go forward without demolishing those two buildings. I think there seems to be a consensus developing that the other buildings they seek to demolish, there is little support for. And we have such momentum in this town for so many things we've gotten together on, from the Thunder to the ballet to so many things, and I think this seems to me that reasonable people could step back, take another look at this, and not make a rush to judgment on the demolition of these two buildings. Thank you.
Thank you. Open it up for questions from board members.
I have one or two comments. First off, I think we heard today that as far as the Downtown Design Review Committee, the code that applies to that particular committee does not have any provision for demolition. However, we've heard today and in the prior meetings a lot about historic preservation in these buildings, especially these two buildings we've talked about or that we've focused on today. And actually, the HP code does have demolition provisions in it. And the key factor for demolition is that if the building does not have any viable economic use, then that's a basis for demolition. So effectively, that's what I see as my basis for how I will vote today. And that we heard earlier from Sand Ridge's folks that there is no viable use for these, economic viable use for these properties. There are people in downtown Oklahoma City that have undertaken residential developments downtown. When I went on this board, I think we had a shortage of 7,500 families missing from the downtown area. And so the idea has been, well, let's repopulate with families and so on. I know one particular developer has undertaken that. It's been a mixed reward situation, and a very large problem with the downtown residential development is the lack of parking. And it's not that the parking is across the street, but it needs to be adjacent to the building and services the tenants in that building. And I don't think that any of these buildings we've talked about today are going to be are going to be developed in a fashion that provides that kind of amenity to those tenants. Consequently, I think it impacts the economic value of the properties, and really, they have none. That's the bottom line where I am, and that's the kind of position I see today in my vote.
Well, at our last meeting, and the last request that I made was to sustain or to keep the Indian Temple. After further looking at that, I think I made a mistake. And, of course, my stand, again, I think we did make a mistake in a lot of ways when we tore down some of our old buildings. But after looking at what we've got here, and not just looking at it today, but for several weeks now, I just see that we need to move forward. I think we need to, in my opinion, uphold the position of the DDRC.
Jim, is that a motion or just an opinion? Sorry. Is that your motion or just your opinion at this point?
I'd make that a motion.
Second.
Please record your votes. The appeal is denied.
Do we need need to have a finding or basis for that finding?
That will be, will that be made in the report, or does it need to be made now on the record?
Do you want to read that into the...
Yeah, it needs to be read. I think it needs to be read right into the record as far as the basis of it. The basis, at least in my mind, for denial or not sustaining the appeal is that, or sustaining the decision by the...
Hold on. Folks, I'm sorry. We are still in session. The meeting is still going on. Folks, please. Everybody's free to go, but the meeting is still going on, and we have some procedural business to take care of, so you're free to leave, but please continue the conversations outside. Thank you.
The DDRC finding was structural integrity of the buildings, functional and viability of the buildings, and the retention and restoration was not economically feasible. That's my basis for it.
Let me add one more, because I think in the statutory scheme we do have some even developed case law for demolition of historic properties, and that is there's a finding that there is no, hang on, I have exactly the right words, there's no viable economic use for these properties.
You include that in your motion?
And that would be part of my motion, yes.
Second that.
Okay. Do we need to vote again?
Yeah.
There we go. Vote.
What's
somebody going red?
I am. I'm red.
He's red.
Oh, you're red. Okay.
Oh.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Second.
All right. We're adjourned.
All in favor?